The rising cost of childcare is forcing some working parents to leave their jobs, according to a new report. Figures from the Daycare Trust suggest some parents faced a rise of around 6% last year, despite a freeze in most wages. Sky's David Crabtree reports.
Tough choices face parents who want to juggle work with childcare. Nurseries like Busy Bees in Birmingham do what they can to keep costs down. But when being in or out of work makes little financial difference, the pressure mounts.
I've had to reduce my working hours because financially I'm better off working part-time and bringing Nyla here part-time rather than working full-time and Nyla being here full-time.
Figures from the campaigning group, the Daycare Trust, show that the hourly rate for childcare of an infant under 2 has increased by 5.8% in the past year. On that basis, the average annual expenditure now stands at £5,103. And according to the Taxman, 44,000 fewer families are getting help with childcare as a result of government cuts.
I think the government shouldn't subsidise tax credits. I think they can't afford to at the moment, looking at the state of public finances. It's just not an option. We need to focus on tackling the deficit, and there are other ways that the government can make childcare affordable.
Joanna Fletcher has saved £300 a month in childcare costs by condensing her working hours into 4 days instead of 5. Her husband, who's about to be made redundant, has a clear view of what the government should do.
Do they have to take responsibility for my children? No, but you know, I think they should be stimulating the economy, creating jobs and making sure that I can go out there and get the money to pay for them to go to nursery.
My husband, who convinced me that for my sanity I should go back to work and should try to make the best of time spent at work and actually don't think about my wages balance the nursery fees.
After having Amelie 18 months ago, former charity worker Rebecca O'Neill decided it was not worth going back to work.
I think that a mum can look after their baby better than anyone else can. You know your child inside and out. And unless there was a real difference in the amount of money you were taking home, then it doesn't make any sense to go back to work for me.
Stagnant wages, changes to tax credits and above-inflation childcare costs all add to a depressing equation for an increasing number of parents. David Crabtree, Sky News, Birmingham.
Well, for two differing views on this, I'm joined by Professor Helen Penn, a childcare expert from the University of London, and by Emma Boon, who's a campaign director for the TaxPayers Alliance. Very good evening to you both. Professor Helen Penn, clearly there are problems here. We all know stories of parents who are struggling to pay for childcare. What can we do about it? Is it down to the government or down to us?
I'm not necessarily suggesting that the government should pay more for childcare, but their money that they spend, they're spending unwisely. They could get much more for their money if they distributed existing monies better. They pay quite a lot towards supporting childcare, but a lot of the money gets dissipated. Most other countries have introduced fee capping so that no parent need pay more than 15% of household income. Here we pay around about 35% of household income on childcare.
15% sounds much more likely, and I'm sure, Emma Boon, it's something the Taxpayers Alliance would approve of, but I mean, it still comes down to money, who's got it, who puts it in, how we juggle it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a myth here that more public spending is what's needed. We are already spending a much higher proportion of our GDP in this country on childcare than many other comparable economies around the world. So I don't think that spending more money is the answer, but I do agree with Professor Helen Pendas there, who said that it's actually spending that money more effectively that's the answer. And it's important to remember that a lot of what has driven up the costs of childcare is increasing regulation on childcare. So previously, where informal arrangements between groups of parents would have worked just fine, now we're seeing actually lots of those arrangements having to be regulated, or people are needing to sort of have some kind of regulation or some kind of certification. So I think that you need to factor that in, and perhaps a lot of this has been driven by that regulation.
Helen Penn, that seems to make sense. We'd all appreciate less regulation. But what about how the money is put into the system? There is a case, a showcase, I guess, in some European countries where the money goes directly from government into helping to subsidise nurseries rather than going through the parents' pocket first. Is that one answer?
Yes, it's much more efficient way of spending money, and rather than giving parents all kinds of tax credits and benefits and so on, if the nurseries were subsidised directly and there was some kind of capping in place, you'd get much cheaper rates. That's the experience of countries like Norway, for example, where they have just as much non-state provision as us, perhaps slightly less, but round about the same. They have a system of capping and direct grants, and it works.
Emma Boon, what about that? That's one answer. Any other suggestions that would help? And we seem to pay more pro rata for childcare than just about anybody else in Western Europe or the developed world, don't we?
Yes, and just to pick up on the point about things like working tax credits that were mentioned by Sally Thompson of the Adam Smith Institute in your packages then, things like that are crazy, because you're effectively saying to parents, when you start working, OK, we're going to give you these working tax credits so that it will be more affordable for you to go back to work and you have to worry about that. But actually all you're doing is giving people who are probably on quite low household incomes some of their own taxes back in benefits. So why not just tax those people less in the first place, and creating this sort of complicated system where you have a range of different credits and benefits that were available to parents when they're going back to work actually hasn't helped, because something like working tax credits at one point had a take-up rate of only about just over 50%. So some of the families that you're intending to help aren't taking up those benefits. They either don't know that they're eligible for them, or no one's telling them that they're eligible for them, or they're simply not claiming them. So it's a ridiculous system that we've got at the moment. And as two of the working mums in your package said just then, they weren't sure whether they'd be better off going back to work, or they in fact cut their hours, or one of those women just stopped working altogether. And that's not good for the economy, because we're losing parents who would be working, who would be contributing to the economy, and who are skilled workers potentially.
Helen Penn, one thing is noticeable, and I mean, a lot of parents say this, the only real alternative for a lot of them is to go to a private nursery or kindergarten or care centre. And a lot of them do seem to charge an awful lot of money. There doesn't seem to be any cap on the profits they can make. And it is, in a lot of parts of the country, almost impossible for people to meet those bills, isn't it?
Yep, that's right. The ceiling is not so... The cost of childcare is not so very much greater in other countries. It's just that the subsidy systems work much better. And so if the nurseries were funded differently, and they were different kinds of nurseries, a lot more voluntary nurseries, probably the system would work a lot better.
Emma Boon, it looks like both of you agree in a way that we need a pretty serious overhaul here. The government really needs to take a very serious look at this and remove some of the regulation and find more efficient ways of getting the money to parents and to educate children, look after children.
Absolutely. The system at the moment is so heavily skewed towards regulated formal arrangements, where in the past some informal arrangements were working. Of course we want some regulation on childcare. Of course safety of our children is an issue, and ensuring that we have sensible and secure childcare arrangements for children, and that appropriate people are looking after our children in formal childcare arrangements. But having this huge increase, as we've heard from childcare, people who want to use informal childcare arrangements, having this huge increase in the burden of policy and regulation simply hasn't helped, and has driven up costs. And that I do think is the major thing that's driven up the costs, and is now being passed on to parents.
Emma Boon and Professor Helen Penn, appreciate you both joining us and giving us your views. Thank you.